When you think of the New Testament, you probably picture one single sacred book, right? But what if I told you it's actually a library, a whole collection of documents written by different people at different times, all carefully chosen from a much larger pool of writings? So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the fascinating story of how this incredible library was actually built.
And that really is the central question, isn't it? For centuries, early Christian communities had all these different texts floating around. So, how in the world did we get from a flood of writings to the specific 27 books we know today? Who were the gatekeepers, and what exactly was their criteria? Let's dive in and find out. So, where do we even begin? Well, our story starts way back in the first century, right in the years after the life of Jesus. Before any book could be chosen for the library, it had to be written in the first place. This first phase is all about that original source material, the accounts from the people who were actually there. You see, for the early church, the absolute gold standard was this idea of apostolic witness. They put a huge value on texts that came directly from the apostles, the original eyewitnesses, or from their closest friends and companions. Think of it like the difference between a biography written by a stranger and an autobiography written by the person themselves. That direct connection to the events was everything. And what you end up with is this really diverse collection of raw materials. You've got the four Gospels, each giving a unique angle on Jesus' life. You have the Acts of the Apostles, which is basically a history book of the early church. Then there are the Epistles. These are letters written to guide specific communities. And of course, you've got the book of Revelation, this incredible work of prophetic vision. So a whole range of styles were in the mix right from the start. Okay, so all this variety, it actually created a huge new challenge. With so many different documents floating around, the early church realized they needed a single, reliable, and authoritative collection that everyone could turn to for guidance. And we're not talking about an easy job here. We're talking about dozens and dozens of texts. Besides the Gospels we know today, there were others, like the Gospel of Thomas, plus tons of other letters and prophecies. And some of these had teachings that flat out contradicted each other, which, as you can imagine, created a ton of confusion for these growing communities. So that raises the big question, right? If you're an early Christian, how could you possibly know for sure that the book your community was reading was the real deal? How could you tell the difference between a genuine apostolic writing and something else? Well, the answer came in the form of what's called a canon. And the word itself is perfect. It literally means a measuring stick. The canon was going to be the official list of books that met a very specific standard. It was the yardstick against which all other writings could be measured, a way to finally define the authoritative scriptures for the entire faith.
Okay, so they have this measuring stick. How exactly do they use it? Well, this is what's so interesting. The selection process wasn't random, and it wasn't just political. It was guided by a surprisingly clear set of standards, almost like a quality control checklist for scripture. And this checklist is really fascinating. First up, apostolic origin. Did it have a direct link to an eyewitness? Check. Second, orthodox teaching. Did its message actually line up with the core beliefs of the church? Check. Third, and this one's a biggie, widespread use. Was this a book that major Christian communities everywhere, from Jerusalem to Rome, were already using and trusted? And finally, scriptural consistency. Did it make sense when read alongside the Old Testament scriptures they already accepted? So here's the bottom line. This whole process was basically a giant filter. The books that checked all four of those boxes got in because they were seen as preserving the true, authentic message. And all those other texts? Well, many of them were left out simply because they failed to meet one or more of these crucial standards for authenticity or orthodoxy. Now, one thing that's really important to get is that this didn't happen overnight. This wasn't the result of one big meeting or some powerful figure making a decree. The final list we have today was the product of a slow, gradual agreement that was built up over hundreds of years. This timeline really lays it all out. First, you have the writing period, from about 50 to 100 AD. Then, for the next couple of hundred years, those texts are copied, shared, debated, and used in worship. Over time, a sort of informal consensus starts to form around the most trusted ones. It's only then, at the very end of the 4th century, that you have church councils at places like Hippo and Carthage getting together to formally recognize the list that everybody had pretty much already agreed on. And after all that time, centuries of writing, debating, and using these texts, it all comes down to this one number, 27. When the Council of Carthage met in 397 AD, they weren't inventing a new list from scratch. They were simply putting an official stamp on the 27 books that the Church, through long and careful consensus, had already come to see as the real deal. So, after all that, what's the legacy of this incredibly careful, centuries-long process? Well, what we're left with is a curated library of texts that has had a truly profound and lasting impact on the entire world.
When you boil it all down, the whole point of creating the canon was about one thing: preservation. It was a way to make sure that the core gospel message and the foundational teachings of the Christian faith would be passed down intact for all the generations that would follow.
And its influence? I mean, it's just undeniable. This collection has been the foundational blueprint for Christian theology and worship for 2 millennia. It's been a primary source for moral teachings, and its reach goes way beyond the Church, profoundly shaping Western art, literature, and even our laws. It's no wonder it became the most widely distributed book in human history.
So think about this. The next time you pick up a New Testament, or even just see one on a shelf, remember, it's not just a book. It's a curated library. It's the end result of a centuries-long conversation about what mattered most. Knowing that it was so carefully built, not just revealed, how does it change the way we read it today? It's a question that gives a whole new depth to the book that has shaped so much of our world.